All right, hello, AP World History students. Today's date is January 24th, 2019. Just to fill you in on what we're going to be covering in class, first thing you're going to do is go ahead and take your Chapter 14 reading quiz. What I recommend that you do is try your best to remember any of the questions that we cover on that quiz, as I guarantee that we'll probably go over at least 3/4 of those questions today. You want to make sure you turn in your great dying notes before the strike, your great dying questions that you guys did in groups before the strike, as well as I am passing out a class note sheets that has all of the key concepts that you need to know from Chapter 14. What I recommend that you do is you copy these questions as we go through them in our class lecture. This would be great review, not only for our chapter test, but as well as for our AP exam. Your homework for tonight is you want to make sure that you read the Silver Trade article that I emailed to you guys before the strike. And what I recommend that you do is you annotate it and come up with 5 open-ended questions, as we will have a Socratic seminar worth points for that on Monday when you return. There's also an exit slip where you need to write an introduction as well as a thesis to the content that we learned in today's class. Okay? But let's go ahead and get started. Our overall objective today is to describe the trading post empires in the Indian Ocean. That's one objective, but you could even take it a step further and test your knowledge from Chapter 13 by being able to compare and contrast European interaction in the ocean to that of the Americas. That's what Chapter 13 focused on, looking at the colonization of the Aztecs, the North American colonies as well. And you want to be able to kind of compare and contrast what's going on in the Indian Ocean in the early modern era between 1450 to 1750 to that of the Americas. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first key concept question that you need to be able to answer is describe the cause and effects of Portugal's trade with West Africa. All right. So let's first go over the causes. The first thing that you want to understand, looking at the causes, is specifically the need for spices, and this image kind of represents that. During this time in Europe, there was a high demand for spices such as nutmeg, mace, cloves, pepper, and they also wanted silk, cotton, emeralds, rubies, right? These are all things that are high demand in Europe, right? These were hot commodities. And remember, during this time, Europeans were simply just trying to find ways that they could have efficient trade routes to hopefully lower the price of these goods, because they were paying a heavy price for that. All right, so the need for spices was definitely a cause. Another thing was the recovery from the Black Death, which is represented out here. Remember, the Black Death wiped out close to a third to 3/4 of the population in some areas of Europe. Well, during the early modern era, one of the things that you're starting to get is population growth. As a result of population growth, governments were getting stronger. They were able to tax civilians better and more efficiently and gain income. They were able to build militaries. As a result of building militaries and also the innovation of gunpowder from the East, their weapons are becoming more advanced. And because of this rise in economy, you're starting to get private trade to emerge. And as a result of private trade, one of the things that you'll start to get is more people wanting to invest in expeditions to the Indies to obtain these spices. So population growth, right? So you're getting large of some of these big cities, urbanization. Now, one thing I want you to also understand is the question is, most spices typically came from the Muslims, right? That's typically where those trade routes existed. I want you to ask yourself, is this okay? Would it be okay for these European empires to obtain the spices from some of the Muslims' territory? No, it wouldn't be. And the reason why was simply because of expense, right? The Muslim territories, the Ottoman Empire, was simply charging expensive prices for these spices. Another thing to consider is just the trade routes. right? These were also the sailors that were coming from Italy, more than likely Venice, were also charging extremely high prices. So if you were territories such as Portugal, the Dutch, Great Britain, Spain, you wanted to find ways in which you could obtain these resources more efficiently. I also want you to consider we're still not too far along from the Crusades, so you're still getting that religious conflict that existed. In fact, one of the reasons that caused the Portugal's trade with West Africa was the belief from Prester John, who was a mysterious European monarch, as your text calls him, looking to try to continue a Christian kingdom and continue the Crusades, right? So all in all, what you need to be able to do from this slide is sum up for me exactly what were the causes of Portugal's trade with West Africa, right? Which would lead to a lot of the trading post empires in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so this map right here is very important simply because it resembles a lot of the content that was stated in the previous slide. Some things I want you to note here was that this is the spice trade before the early modern era. So right over here in this map, you're getting a lot of, this is where the spices are coming from. If you're looking at these, the trade route simply would head westward and it would go through the Mediterranean Sea. And what you want to understand is this right here is religious conflicted territory in the sense that this was all land that was very controversial during the Crusades. So the issue that if you were someone that existed in West Europe, that one of your concerns was specifically that you would have to go through Muslim territory in order to obtain those spices. At the same time, a lot of these traders were typically Venetian traders or merchants. And in order to obtain those resources, they would be charging a very high price. So if you're Portugal, if you're the Dutch, if you're Spain, your overall objective is to find ways in which that you could get to these spice islands. To do so where you're no longer paying the heavy prices from Venice or the Muslim territories in the Middle East. All right, so going on with it, continuing with the objective, describe the causes and effects of Portugal's trade with West Africa. One thing you also want to understand is some of the cause and effects of this is Europeans had to pay gold and silver for prices or for the spices. Okay, that's typically what the Muslim territories wanted. That's typically what the Spice Islands wanted in return. Now, in order for you to make a fair trade, what you need to do was to obtain silver or gold. And I want you to ask yourself, this is a common theme that you will get throughout this unit in chapter 14, is where do you get this silver and gold from? Well, you get this specifically from two areas. You're getting this from West Africa, but you're also getting them from the Americas, more specifically Mexico and Bolivia. As a result of this, Spain would be dominant in the silver trade because remember, a lot of this territory, right, of Mexico, right, in South America is obtained by the Spanish, right, and there's a mass influx of silver that's being taken from here, right, and this would make Spain, if you look at these trade routes where it's flowing, let's look at Mexico, for example, you're looking at this trade route, it is flowing specifically from Mexico, right, to China, because China, as you'll later read, they had a demand for that silver as a result of their currency, right, and as a result of their taxation procedures. But also looking at this, it's also going specifically to from Mexico to Spain, right? So silver and gold was typically what was exchanged for this. All right, so just a quick review. This would be a good time for you to pause the video, and I want you to explain the significance of some of these routes, right? So we have Vasco da Gama's route, more specifically, and I also want you to consider Bartholomew Diaz, who's not on here. All right, so this would be a great time for you to pause it, and I'll answer in a few moments. All right, good. So one thing you want to consider, remember, just relating to that last slide, the goal is to get to the Spice Islands, right, to make trade less costly and also more efficient. So the Portuguese, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, who's willing to invest a lot of money in terms of these expeditions. Remember, he had two prominent sailors. You're looking at Vasco da Gama, right, and Bartholomew Diaz. Vasco da Gama was the first one that was able to sail to India, sailing across the tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean. Bartholomew Diaz was a little bit, he came before, and he was the first one that was able to sail across the Cape of Good Hope around the bottom point of Africa. All right, very important to understand that in a way that the Portuguese explorations during this time was only matched by that of the Spaniards, who made most of their expeditions, remember, in the Americas. So moving forward, what were European trading posts in Africa and Asia? Okay. One thing you want to understand is that the Portuguese, that their main goal compared to the Spanish, and this is kind of tying back to our objective, how was it similar and different to the colonization of the Americas? Well, the Portuguese were a little bit different. The Portuguese created a trading post empire. They wanted to control trade. They weren't necessarily concerned about controlling the land or the people, right? In fact, one thing you want to understand that I would write down is that they would typically establish these posts and they would charge non-Portuguese ships about 6 to 10% of their cargo. This is called a cartaz or a pass, right? So their main thing was just to obtain the trade. They want to monopolize the East, I would say the Indian trade by establishing these trading posts. That was it. They didn't care about converting people to the Christian faith. They didn't care about spreading their culture. No, their main objective was specifically controlling trade. Eventually, what you understand is that the Portuguese would decline. These would be as a result of overextending themselves. This would be a result of rising states in Asia. I don't want you to consider this time period as a time of Asian decline. No, they weren't. I mean, we had Asian traders as well. So as a result of this, the Portuguese would become more like a FedEx. And what I mean by this is the Portuguese couldn't dominate Indian Ocean trade, so they gave up. They became heavily involved in moving Asian trade goods to Asian ports, right? So simply just serving as a shipping merchant between different empires. So they sold their shipping services. They were always outnumbered by Asian traders, and this is more than likely simply because of the geographic area. As a result of this, compared to the Spanish, where they tried to dominate once again the land and the territory, the Portuguese would actually immerse themselves in a lot of the culture in Asia and Africa. Many married Asian women, right? They escaped control of the Portuguese government by completely settling in Asian and African ports, becoming locals, and some converted to Islam as well. All right. So comparing this to Spain in the Americas, the Portuguese, they were in some ways letting go of Portuguese culture and just became shipping merchants, just like FedEx, just transporting goods across Asian ports. So they would lose that Portuguese culture in some way. All right, moving forward. This is the time in class where I'm actually going to show you guys a crash course video from John Green. I didn't put a link on this video, but this would be a good time for you to pause it and look at the video questions that I gave you guys and just answer them. If you want to search for the video, it's titled just John Green Crash Course Dutch East. Okay. So some things to consider. Looking at the next objective that we have here, continuing on, what were European trading post-empires in Africa and Asia like? Well, as I stated, the Portuguese would later decline. And what you need to understand is Dutch and English used trade monopolies starting around 1600 to create their trading post empires. They displaced and overtook the Portuguese. I would underline the Dutch because the Dutch definitely had more dominance, right? What do you understand here looking at this first bullet? And I just answered the second question. Who's more dominant, the Dutch or the British? It would definitely be the Dutch. A couple things to acknowledge. The Dutch would go ahead and take over the more of Indonesia, while Great Britain would focus on India. Great Britain would not be successful. And the reason why they're not specifically successful was simply because the Mughals were militarily stronger than the British at this point. So as a result of this, the British would actually have to go ahead and engage in just trade agreements with the Mughals, right? Paying a heavy tax, right? So you're not going to see that dominance there. Their focus wasn't necessarily so much on spices, but it was on the textile industry, right? However, later on in history, Great Britain would be able to obtain more power, and this would change. On the other hand, the Dutch would go ahead and they would take over Indonesia as well as the Banda Islands, and they were militarily stronger, right? In fact, after watching the video, the Dutch East Trading Company functioned more like a military than it did a business. They were given priority to be able to use military force against the locals. So, in fact, the Dutch would go ahead and kill 15,000 people on the Banda Islands, replace them with Dutch planters, and then enslave whatever locals were left. Right. So I want you to consider, how is this similar or different from Spain in the Americas? Right. Good. So moving forward, this kind of shows the dominance of the Dutch East India Company. A couple things I want you to realize is the Dutch basically went ahead and monopolized the spice trade. And one thing you want to look at here in this map is look at the trade routes that existed as well as who they are trading with. Right. One thing to acknowledge here is Japan. Right. During this time, the Japanese simply would later stop trade with many European empires except for the Dutch. So one thing you understand is, coming from the Dutch to Japan, right? You would get all these. So from Japan, you would typically get a lot of precious metals, right? In exchange, they would give silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury goods. That's coming from the Dutch to Japan, or to Japan. You're also looking at trade with China, right? One of the things you want to look at here is you're getting an exchange of porcelain, tea, sugar, silk, right? This is all coming from China. In exchange, what the Chinese are getting are spices, luxury goods, and cloth from the Dutch East Indian Company, right? I mean, trade is expanding all over. And one thing you want to realize is just that they really monopolize this area amongst the Indian Ocean with the spices. This is the territory that a lot of the European empires were fighting for, and the Dutch were able to monopolize that. So this is a good time. I want you to kind of pause the video and ask yourself, why did Europeans mostly transport goods from one Asian country to another in Asia and the Indian Ocean? Which countries were involved? Yeah? So stop it. All right. So continuing forward, Ashley, flying back with a review. Going back to this, one thing you want to understand here is the Portuguese. Going back, remember, they once again they couldn't dominate the Indian Ocean trade, so they gave up and they became a FedEx, just transporting goods amongst Asian ports. Remember, one thing you want to understand here is a review question. The Dutch and British got into this, right? Profits could be used to buy Asian goods without paying any gold and silver, and you could kind of see this. Look at just the prominence the Dutch had, right? And last but not least, kind of going back to this, is the British. Remember, the British, they made trade agreements specifically with the Mughals in India. And as a result of the posts that they established, they were able to get some form of trade, right? Okay. So next key concept question that you need to answer is, describe how imperial expansion relied on the increased use of gunpowder cannons and armed trade to establish large empires. The key thing I want you to underline here is gunpowder. How did technology and weapons result into this expansion? Well, in your text, one of the first things that they go ahead and go over is the Philippines, right? This is a fun video that you could watch. It's talking about the biography of Ferdinand Magellan. It's the Animaniacs. It's a film from the 90s. Back when I was a little burba, I would enjoy watching it. But it goes over Ferdinand Magellan, who's actually, you could see him as a trader. He was Portuguese, but then he sailed for the Spanish. He was always looking for the Indies, but he kept stumbling over different territories. So one of these territories was the Philippines. And the great thing about the Philippines is you're close enough to the Indies where it's a successful trade port. So as a result of this, the Philippines would become a Spanish colony, and this would be a Spanish colony up until 1898, right? There's a lot of Spanish heritage still today in the Philippines. I mean, the term Philippines itself comes from the naming as a result of King Philip during that time. And what you understand from your text is Spain was able to simply take over the Philippines quite easily as a result of gunpowder and the military, right? Ferdinand Magellan was actually killed in the Philippines. He agreed to fight with some of the locals with a small, I guess, civil skirmishing between them, and he died as a result of that, right? But the Spanish was able to take over the Philippines, and this was very important. Simply because, as you will read about next week, the Philippines became crucial in the silver trade, right? Looking at the Philippines, it became very rich and very diverse. Manila became the new colonial capital during this time. They converted to Christianity. Manila became very rich and diverse with more than 40,000 people. 3,000 of them being Japanese and 20,000 of them being Chinese. So you're getting a lot of this trade that's going on between these groups along with the Spanish. But once again, it's the result of gunpowder that they were able to obtain this. The Spanish were. Okay. And like I said, very important for silver trade. You're looking at Manila, the importance, 40,000 people there, very diverse population with 3,000 Japanese and 20,000 Chinese, right? And as you will read over this weekend, this would have a huge impact on the silver trade. Okay. All right, moving forward, there was a quick section in your text about the Japanese shogunate. This is the Japanese hierarchy. We're looking at the spice chart, looking at the social structure. What do you want to understand here is that the emperor was typically the top of the society. However, he had very little power. Most of this was actually from the shogun, right? The shogunate, you're looking at kind of that warrior class, I guess you could say, that was able to enforce much of the existence of just the way society ran. Then you'd have the daimyo, which were the wealthy landowners, the samurai. I want you to think about this back to our last unit, or a couple units ago on Europe, feudalism. How you'd have the knights that would protect the nobility. What you're getting here, the samurai were Japanese warriors that would affect the daimyo, right? Then we get our peasants, and then we'd go down to the merchants, right? The lowest class, simply because they produced nothing on their own. They were simply just trading. A couple things that you want to understand about this. So there's a better picture of it. Now, there was a big problem in Japan here. In the mid-16th century, Japan was engaged in a lot of feudal warfare. More than likely, there was a lot of disagreement specifically between the daimyo as well as the shogun, right? Well, the good thing about this time, there was an increased amount of trade. There was, in the mid-16th century, Japan was allowing the European military technology to come in, the shipbuilding skills, the knowledge, just private trade, even religious ideas. Christianity was spreading during this time. However, in early 17th century, what you'd start to get here was the daimyo would try to challenge. You're looking at the rich nobility, right? That well-educated class. They would challenge the power of the shogun. As a result of this, the Tokugawa shogunate limit their access to trade, so they're stopping here any interaction with Europe, right? With the exception of the Dutch. They see the Europeans as a threat, so they're stopping any Christianity that exists. They're torturing, and killing a lot of missionaries. Anyone that converted to Christianity, they were killed, right? What you want to understand about this is this would pretty much isolate Japan up until just close to the 1800s, right? This is very important. I have a couple images here. Here's an old Saturday Night Live sketch where, I just like this image simply because it's showing in some ways a Japanese samurai that's going against someone that's obviously of Western descent, European or American, but short story is it's showing just the conflict that existed between Japanese culture and anything that's outside of it. If you ever watched the movie Last Samurai, which is not necessarily the best historical movie, but it's a good film by Tom Cruise, when you're looking at just the Americans in the late 1800s that would come to Japan and go ahead and encourage them to trade, right? This kind of shows historically accuracy in the sense that Japan would be completely isolated up until that time, right? That they did not want to become westernized. Okay, but this was it was an entertaining movie, The Last Samurai, but completely a lot of falsified information, with the exception of Matthew Perry coming in and establishing the trade agreements to open up trade between Japan and America, right? But overall, you're getting here is that they banned European traders except the Dutch, right? Which I kind of explained in a previous slide. All right, so your homework for tonight. In what ways were trading post-empire similar and different to the Americas established in the Americas? What I'd like you to do is, based on the evidence in your reading as well as your text, just write an intro paragraph with a thesis. I will grade you on the AP rubric with that. Okay? Excellent. Well, if you have any questions, just make sure you shoot me an email.